from Washington, D.C.
Tonight, primary day. Voters in 6 states head to the polls, including here in Georgia, where we join you live tonight. The cost of living, control of Congress, and the future direction of the Republican Party are all on the ballot. We'll speak with Atlanta Mayor Andre Dickens about what voters here are saying.
Also on the ballot, Trump's midterm influence, the president's grip on the GOP, facing another test today with his 11th hour endorsement of Ken Paxton in next week's high-stakes Texas Senate runoff. We'll discuss the president's influence over these decisive races with Josh McKoon, chairman of the Georgia Republican Party.
And still blocked. Trump threatens Iran with a, quote, big hit if no peace deal is made soon. As the Strait of Hormuz remains closed, energy markets stay on edge and fears mount over the cost for investors and consumers alike.
From Atlanta, Georgia, welcome to this special edition of Balance of Power on Bloomberg TV and radio. Alongside Kaylee Lyons, I'm Joe Matthew. Kaylee, here we go again. And of course, we're counting down to the polls closing now, 2 hours from now in Georgia, one of 6 states voting today. And we've got a couple of doozies here in Georgia, specifically the Senate primary, more specifically, is the one that seems to be getting the most attention. Who's going to run against Jon Ossoff?
Yep, the incumbent Democrat. There's 3 Republicans who are vying and vying hard. 2 of them, Republican Congressman Mike Collins and Buddy Carter, as well as Derek Dooley, who has been endorsed by the governor of Georgia, Brian Kemp. President Trump did not endorse in this race, though he did make an endorsement decision in a separate Republican Senate primary runoff today, that, of course, being Texas. Yeah, that was a mind blower for a lot of people. He waited 76 days to weigh in on this one, finally going with the Attorney General, the MAGA candidate, as opposed to the longtime establishment candidate, incumbent John Cornyn. And we're going to drill down into the primary here in Georgia as the polls prepare to close within the next 2 hours. But we head to Washington first, following the news that rocked the political world as the White House endorsed Ken Paxton in the Texas runoff here against sitting Senator John Cornyn. As we mentioned, here was Vice President J.D. Vance. He had his turn today in the White House briefing room commenting on the president's decision. Listen.
When it really counted, Ken Paxton was there for the country, was there for the president, and that's why he ultimately earned the president's endorsement. He thinks he's going to be a better senator, thinks he's going to make a better candidate.
Let's stay at the White House now with Bloomberg's Courtney Subramanian, who joins us live from the North Lawn. Courtney, do we have any sense exactly what the president was thinking in terms of timing here? They've got a week until this race is decided.
Yeah, well, I think there's a couple things at play here. First, as you mentioned, J.D. Vance said the president wanted to send a message to Republicans who fall out of line with the president. And that's something we've seen him say in other elections. He's been emboldened by the defeats of Senator Bill Cassidy in Louisiana and the Indiana state senators who didn't go along with his redistricting plan. He wants to rein in the Republican Party and eliminate the folks who aren't necessarily in line with him. So I think this is part of that message he's sending as we inch closer to the midterms. And we also saw Ken Paxton play his cards right. He had offered to step out of the Senate runoff if Senate Republicans abolished the filibuster and went on to pass the president's voting bill. And that's something that also played to the president's priorities. So I think, again, this is a message the president is sending to other Republicans in the party.
Well, speaking of the president's priorities, Courtney, he obviously is prioritizing Iran and efforts to make a deal with Iran, having, in his words, called off planned strikes against Iran for today. But he told reporters earlier while touring the planned site of the ballroom at the White House that he could still be hitting hard Iran in the coming days if no deal is made. Let's listen.
The decision. So they called up. They had heard I made the decision. They said, sir, could you give us a couple of more days because we think they're being reasonable.
How many days for Iran to come to?
Well, I mean, I'm saying 2 or 3 days, maybe Friday, Saturday, Sunday, something, maybe early next week, a limited period of time.
We've seen deadlines like this set time and again, Courtney, and they often pass. Is this one real?
Well, I think this is a tactic we've seen throughout this war. This is a president who, issues a threat and then ultimately backs off that threat as negotiations continue. So it is part of Trump's playbook when it comes to Iran. He said this decision to hold off on strikes came at the request of several Gulf leaders in the region who wanted to see these talks play out. We also heard from the vice president today in the press briefing room, who reiterated the message that the president has two choices here. He could, he's locked and loaded and ready to resume military action, as the vice president described it, or, the preferred method of reaching a deal. I think, again, we are seeing this administration just buy more time as these talks play out.
All right, Bloomberg's Courtney Subramanian reporting live from the White House, North Lawn this evening. Thank you so much. Meanwhile, here in Georgia, polls are set to close in just under 2 hours following a shattering of early primary voting records leading up to this election day, as both Republican and Democratic candidates vie for nominations in federal and statewide races. And joining us now live here in Atlanta is the mayor, Andre Dickens. Mr. Mayor, welcome to Bloomberg TV and Radio. It's good to be here in your city. Thank you for having us.
Thank you.
As it is primary day, I just wonder if you can give us a status update on what turnout is looking like, knowing early turnout was so strong, if everything is running smoothly at polling places in the city today.
Yeah, Georgia, we're a battleground state,
yes,
so we're
indeed.
excited for these elections. This is a big deal right now. You have Senator Ossoff and his challengers, and early voting has really been heavy, and so today the voting turnout has been pretty good. So I think that all eyes are going to be on Georgia once again. So in about 2 hours, we'll start to see polls and returns come in. People are excited about that. There's also governor's election right now, the primary. So we have strong candidates on the Republican and the Democratic side, lieutenant governor, and then our county seats. So lots at stake for a mayor. I want partners with all these people so I can get things done for my people in the city of
all
Atlanta.
good reports from the polling sites. You're not running out of ballots. People aren't in line too long.
No,
been a success so far.
Right now it's going well. We planned well. We worked very well with all the elections officials. Things so far so good. Fingers crossed. With 2 hours to go, no bad news. It's good news.
Well, so let's talk about things that might be on voters' minds as they head to the polls today. What's issue number one in Atlanta right now?
Yeah, affordability. Number one is affordability. The cost of rent, the cost of gas, the cost of food, the cost of health expenses are high. So people in Georgia are really expressing themselves at various places around the cost of living just being too high. So that is number one on people's minds. And then number two is what's going to happen with Iran, what's going to happen with our international affairs. This is causing a lot of consternation around how are the people of America being affected by our international diplomacy.
Well, there's a lot that you just said there, and when you have people paying $4 a gallon when they're not even used to paying $3 in some cases, this is a pretty big deal economically, and it's pushing through, as we've discussed with a lot of stakeholders here at this table this week. It's pushing through into the costs of a lot of other things, including food, and it's hitting the lowest income hardest, which is so often the case. And you've got something that we wanted to talk to you about is so many folks try to attack housing and affordable housing. Your Neighborhood Reinvestment Act that you just reintroduced takes a slightly different approach. While it acknowledges housing, it also tries to acknowledge the environment, the conditions in which people are living that make up a neighborhood. Is that the answer right now as we wait for interest rates to come down, building materials to be cheaper? Is this the way you get to these people now?
Yeah, absolutely. Places like Atlanta are growing extensively, but we're not having balanced growth. There's still people on the lower ends of the rung that are just not able to climb up.
Yeah.
So we have to invest in those neighborhoods, those communities, affordable housing, early child care learning, as well as grocery stores and affordable food. Where the federal government may not be stepping in, where the cost of things are so high, it is important amongst the local community to invest in our neighborhoods. And so that's the Neighborhood Reinvestment Initiative. We are using the tools of government and public-private partnerships to bring about things that the community is asking for. There are, unfortunately, communities in our city that have to travel 2 buses and maybe 15, 20 minutes just to get fresh groceries. That's taking too long for them to get there, and it's unaffordable right now. So we're stepping in. Where SNAP benefits are, wishy-washy at best at times, and the federal the administration is not always favorable towards these people on the lower end. We're stepping in to help out with housing affordability and those other things.
Well, it's a very important initiative, and as we consider the kind of dichotomy in economic experiences, I wonder, as we're sitting here on Georgia Tech's campus, you, of course, are a Georgia Tech alum yourself. We're in a city in which Joe and I, every time we've Ubered somewhere, have had the option to take a Waymo. There's a lot of technological focus here and technological development. Do you see it in artificial intelligence, too, as something that could exacerbate these existing disparities, or does it help to close the gap further?
Yeah, so artificial intelligence is something that I'm keeping a really keen eye on. As an engineer, a Georgia Tech alum, I enjoy how technology has assisted us and really given us capacity to do more things. So it's made us more competitive internationally. But what's also happened is people that don't have the skills, that haven't been trained in technology, some of their careers are becoming obsolete. And so what do we do with those people? So we have to get them in training programs, upskilling and reskilling, but also to make sure that we don't forget that every human being counts. And so if a job is displaced by technology, we need to find a way to make that person have economic opportunity in this community.
How about on a practical level? Is your office using AI? I can only think you can fill more potholes with AI at your back than without.
Yeah, we use AI extensively for a number of things.
Yeah.
AI enables us to determine if there's going to be a water leak. We have it inside of our valves. About 200, 300 valves around the city is producing data that can let us know if this is a small leak or if it's producing bigger and bigger water loss. And that means to go to that area now versus waiting till later. We use it to be able to detect if there's litter or illegal dumping that's taking place, because our garbage trucks are going down your street to pick up your garbage, but it's also detecting abnormalities around the community that then another crew comes in and picks up the dump. And then, using it in our customer service. So you call 311 or you type in 311, you get an AI bot and a number of other things to be able to write some letters and some other things that we normally hand wrote all these. Congratulations, you reached 100 years old, or this is your 50th anniversary of marriage. Yeah. Fortunately, we're using AI for some of those things because it helps us to be able to get a lot more work done.
And finally, Mr. Mayor, here in Atlanta, there will be, 8 World Cup matches coming up this summer, including a semifinal. You've said previously you want this to happen with the city, not to the city.
Exactly.
What do you mean by that? Is the city ready for this, or what are you bracing for?
We are excited for FIFA World Cup 2026. It's about to happen in about 28 days. This is the home of the 1996 Olympics. So 30 years ago, I was on this campus excited about the Centennial Olympic Games, and now we're going to have 8 FIFA matches here. So we're ready from a safety and security perspective, from making sure that people can get around, get through, and get to the games and matches. But we also wanted the community to benefit. Everybody can't afford those expensive tickets. Everybody can't go to the match every day, but can they go to a fan fest? Can they go to a watch party? Can they get some cultural exchanges with the people that are going to be coming here? Can our small businesses thrive? So that's why I wanted it to be with the community and not to the community, where FIFA just happens and people go back to their destination and I don't know what happened downtown. There was a bunch of strangers down there and I didn't benefit. Well, we want Atlantans to come downtown, enjoy themselves, and we want those small businesses. We've given them loans and grants and things to be able to freshen up and to be able to expand their business portfolio and opportunities, and it's producing results. So we're excited and ready.
Yeah, sounds like you have a lot to look forward to, Mr. Mayor. We appreciate you sharing it with us here today on Bloomberg. Mayor Dickens with us live from Atlanta here on Balance of Power. Back on Wall Street, the 30-year yield rising to its highest level since 2007 today, reminding us of this affordability story over concern of, accelerating inflation. For details, we turn to power moves now with Bloomberg's Romaine Bostick, who joins us live from World Headquarters in New York. Hey, Romaine.
Yeah, all the focus right now is on the long end of the Treasury curve. That 30-year yield at one point flirting with about 5.2% here, the highest that we've seen going back to the global financial crisis in 2007. That raises the cost of capital, for everyone. It raises it for governments, it raises it for corporations, and of course it raises it for households. I do want to point out something interesting that happened today. Yields rose, but it actually did on a day where oil prices fell. And that actually breaks the trend that we've seen, and it seems to suggest broader and more concerning structural issues going on right now in the market. That yes, this is about inflation, but it's also about something more. It's about the Treasury issuance. It's about the state of the global economy. And quite frankly, it is about what a lot of people are thinking is that some of the stickiness that we've seen as of late with that inflation might not just be sticky for a couple of years. They might be here to stay for generations to come. That's a big part of the reason why you saw the S&P 500 down for a third straight day, the NASDAQ selling off as well. The Dow and the Russell 2000 were a little bit more resilient, but you did see some selling there. And there were a couple of key topics that came up on investors' radars here about the health of the economy. That included an interesting downgrade for two of the biggest banks, Citigroup and Bank of America, with the analysts there actually saying that there are macro headwinds out there that could actually show up in the bottom lines of these companies when we hear from them again during the next earnings cycle. Meanwhile, Chewy, this is the online pet retailer, they were presenting at a conference today saying that they are seeing stress in the consumer space. And then Cisco also giving a presentation today at that JP Morgan Technology Conference, and they're saying that they're seeing margin headwinds, basically saying they got a lot of orders coming in, but the cost to fulfill those orders, that's going up. And that is right now, I guess, the needle that a lot of people, a lot of companies out there, Joe and Kaylee, are trying to thread.
Yep, and of course tomorrow we'll hear from perhaps the biggest company of all, at least the one that matters most for financial markets, NVIDIA, and we'll be checking with you in tomorrow with those results. Bloomberg's Romaine Bostic, thank you so much. And still ahead, President Trump says that Iran is being reasonable and that he will maybe give them until early next week to make a deal. We'll discuss the latest with Adam Stulberg of the Sam Nunn School here at Georgia Tech, next on Balance of Power on Bloomberg TV and radio.
Come to the table, they're begging to make a deal, because they're begging to make a deal. I hope we don't have to do the war, but we may have to give them another big hit. We may have to give them another big hit. I'm not sure yet.
It's Balance of Power, a special edition on Bloomberg TV and radio, live from Atlanta, Georgia, alongside Kaylee Lines. I'm Joe Matthew. The president there speaking over the sound of construction, the ballroom site behind him, saying we may have to give Iran another big hit if the U.S. and Iran are unable to reach a deal. Joining us now live here in Atlanta is Adam Stulberg, chair and professor at the Sam Nunn School of International Affairs here at Georgia Tech. Professor, it's great to see you and welcome to Balance of Power here on Bloomberg. I'm wondering your thought. Now we've got a 2 to 3 day timeline. If you take the president at his word, the Strait is still closed. Bond markets are starting to freak out. Is this the darkest before dawn moment that we've thought about?
It's hard to say. It seems like we've been at this precipice a number of times. I do think, since energy is one area that I look at, I think we're seeing the problems persist over the long haul. So I don't know that we're going to. I mean, we are at an inflection point, but I think that the die has been cast, if you will, for higher prices and a lot more disarray.
So even if we were to see the Strait of Hormuz opening in whatever kind of deal, assuming one can be reached, do you think it is never going to be a return to the pre-conflict normal?
Yeah, I would. Yeah, excuse me. I definitely would agree. We're not going to return back to where we were. And I think there are 4 basic challenges that the energy markets face. One is the uncertainty of the diplomacy, which you alluded to. But the other is that the ships that are there and the tankers that are there are not in position. It'll take them a while to get into position. I think there's another problem with the supply stocks that are very low that need to be replenished. And then, of course, the damaged infrastructure. And I think, and then the other casualty that I don't think a lot of people have really appreciated is the deterioration of the shock absorbers that were there to help, insulate the world from these kind of perturbations.
The buffers are gone, or at least soon to be, and we have been hearing that Iran may need to soon start shutting wells, which could, I guess, potentially exacerbate the problem. We had headlines running today that NATO is considering joining in the effort to reopen the Strait and potentially start escorting ships. This is what the president was asking for at the very beginning and has chastised our NATO allies for not taking part. What sort of desperation does this smack of? Do you buy that as a plausible solution?
It's hard for me to imagine that they will send ships into harm's way, but I think they'll be part of, once there's a ceasefire or some element of stability, that we would see them there, and it would probably be very, very important for them. I think one of the reasons you're seeing the uptick now, though, of course, is that those supply stocks that you referenced are really being dwindled significantly in Europe, and those prices are beginning to shoot up.
Wow.
Well, I'd like to talk more about Europe's position, because they, of course, were reeling starting in 2022 when Russia invaded Ukraine, having to wean themselves as much as they could off of Russian oil and natural gas, pivoting more to places like Qatar and other energy sources in the Middle East. Then this happens. Does Europe have anywhere else to turn? How does it insulate itself from geopolitical events that could be disruptive to their energy supplies in the future?
Well, I think Europe's long view, even prior to 2022, was to really invest in renewables and deal with the efficiencies and alternatives. But you're right. I mean, obviously, they were dependent on mostly Russian gas. That was the real detrimental shock. But that was much more of a regional impact, very much hitting Europe. Now we're all in the same boat. We're all being affected by that. The oil markets Russia had less leverage itself on the oil markets and the oil prices. There were other places to get it. LNG, obviously, on the natural gas front really emerged. But you're right. I mean, the real challenge for them is in the short term, or in this transition period to the renewables, where are they going to get those hydrocarbons? And they're facing a shock.
Professor, we're here in Atlanta to cover a primary, or a series of primaries, where the issue of high gasoline, high diesel, high oil prices continues to arise. We're at about $4 here on average in Georgia, 4.5 nationally. If this new normal that you're talking about, not going back to prior levels, is in fact what we're facing, we've got triple-digit oil still, could be trending to 120, 150, depending on the analyst you talk to. What will that mean for gasoline, people who are voting today?
Well, it's really interesting. I would say, and I'm not an expert necessarily on Georgia politics, but I think the way energy is figured into this primary and the midterms has not been so much the oil prices. It's been the utilities and the impact that data centers potentially have.
We hear it come up in every program that we've done here.
Yeah. But I think the real question is, by November, is it really going to be the oil prices? Because, as I mentioned before, it's very hard to imagine those oil prices going down significantly, into the first quarter of 2027. So there'll be an issue. And in Georgia, you have a lot of agricultural areas. You have shipping and hauling. You have the airport. So you have those impacts on the consumer and the residents here that are accentuated.
Well, when we consider absent a reopening of the Strait of Hormuz, what is within the power of American political authorities or the administration? We have seen them turning to things like waivers for Russian crude that may be on water already. We obviously are having an active conversation about whether or not sanctions will be eased on Iran to get to a deal or as part of an agreement. What impact does that have when you think about the global markets?
Well, I mean, obviously, on the energy price, it's had a marginal impact. I mean, there's been a lot of oil at sea, Iranian oil at sea, Russian oil at sea, which is being allowed to get to market. But that's a finite amount of oil. And so it's not clear how much that's going to make a fundamental difference. Now, where the Russian issue makes a difference has less to do about the Middle East and more to do with Ukraine.
Right.
And the signals that it's set, the relief that it's providing the Kremlin in financing their war, and also the signals that it's sending that maybe time is on Putin's side as he wages that conflict.
All right, Professor, thank you so much for joining us. Adam Stulberg is chair and professor of the Sam Nunn School of International Affairs here at Georgia Tech. We appreciate your expertise. And of course, while it is primary day in Georgia, it's also primary day in 5 other states, including in Kentucky, where Republican voters are determining whether incumbent Congressman Thomas Massie gets to keep his seat or is ousted, like President Trump wants. He's been criticizing Massie again today, and we'll bring you those details next on this special edition of Balance of Power, live from Atlanta, Georgia, on Bloomberg TV and radio.
Thomas Massie's a terrible congressman. He's been a terrible congressman from day one. Dealing with him is just horrible. I don't think he's a Republican. I think he's actually a Democrat. He's not a libertarian. You know, sometimes they say he's really a Democrat. He votes against us all the time.
This is a special edition of Balance of Power on Bloomberg TV and radio, live from Atlanta, Georgia. Alongside Joe Matthew, I'm Kaylee Lyons, and that was President Trump earlier today, renewing his criticism of Republican Congressman Tom Massie of Kentucky, who is facing a competitive primary today, as voters choose their nominees in his state, as well as here in Georgia, Alabama, Pennsylvania, Oregon, and Idaho. For more, we turn now to our Washington bureau, where Bloomberg's Nancy Cook is standing by. And Nancy, you went to Kentucky to report specifically on this Massie race. You were also incredibly well-sourced in Trump world. Are they feeling confident about the odds that Massie goes down this evening?
They are feeling very confident. They think that the internal polling shows the race. They think that Galbraith is ahead. Al Galbraith, who is Thomas Massie's opponent, they're feeling quite good. The Trump team has had a string of successes lately. They unseated Louisiana Senator Bill Cassidy recently, several state Indiana senators who defied Trump on redistricting. And now all eyes are really on what is going to happen in northern Kentucky in Thomas Massie's district. You have to remember that he defied the president on not supporting the tax and health care bill, on pushing for the release of the Epstein files, and then also not supporting the war in Iran. So unseating him really has been in Trump's bullseye for quite a while. Trump has attacked him excessively on social media, and we've also just seen a ton of donors dump money into these different outside groups that have been attacking Massie pretty relentlessly for weeks.
Yeah. Well, I'm really glad you could join us to talk about this, Nancy, because Massie himself has been pointing to the money. This is a big deal. The most expensive House primary in history at $32 million is pretty shocking, but it's not just how much money. Massie has been pointing to where the money is coming from, specifically the pro-Israel lobby, AIPAC, even naming Miriam Adelson specifically in a series of interviews this week. How's that all playing on the ground in Kentucky?
Well, when I was in Kentucky, I talked with a bunch of voters, and they found it confusing, honestly. They were getting so many mailers every single day, all these different things about Massie, some of which was true, some of which wasn't. It was just misinformation. There were tons of people knocking on their doors, at least one door knocker a day. They were just really being inundated with mailers, door knockers, TV ads. And a lot of people, even people who supported Massie and had liked him, we're starting to feel confused by just the onslaught of information. A lot of people in that district, it's a very red district, they really like Trump, and many of them really like Massie. But I think that all the information flowing there definitely gave some people pause. And I also think Massie has been in Congress since 2011, or 2012, excuse me. So some of the voters that I spoke to in Kentucky were also open to looking at a new candidate potentially.
Well, Nancy, when we consider the candidates that the president is for and against, he's made it abundantly obvious for some time now that he was against Tom Massie. He kept us guessing for a long time who he was going to ultimately endorse and before in the Republican Senate primary in Texas. He finally gave us that answer today. It's the AG, Ken Paxton, not the incumbent, John Cornyn. What took him so long to get to this conclusion? Why let this race get to a runoff next week?
Well, I think that, the president was hearing from a lot of people on both sides. He has a bunch of his former aides from the campaign who are actually working for John Cornyn, who would have loved to have seen him endorse John Cornyn. And then there are also a bunch of people who have been supporting Ken Paxton, including Steve Bannon, who worked in the first Trump White House, and a bunch of real MAGA voices. And I think that what slowed down the endorsement originally was that, I think that there were a bunch of people putting pressure on Trump to support Cornyn, but a lot of people were saying you're really going to alienate your MAGA base if you don't support Paxton. So President Trump sort of put it on ice. However, he has been so frustrated with the Senate's inability to pass this voter ID legislation called the SAVE Act, and has been very frustrated with just the Senate leadership there. And I think he took that frustration out on John Cornyn by endorsing Ken Paxton today. It was a big surprise and a big boon to Paxton before the GOP primary there.
It was a jaw dropper for a lot of people. Bloomberg's Nancy Cook. Nancy, thank you for joining us. Back here in Georgia on this primary day, polls are only open for just over about an hour, a little more, as candidates on both sides fight to win their nominations for federal and state offices. We're tracking a lot of races, and for a closer look at the strategy here on the ground for Republican candidates specifically, we turn now to Josh McKoon, chair of the Georgia Republican Party, live in Atlanta. Mr. Chairman, welcome. It's great to have you on Bloomberg.
Thank you for
I'd
having
like to
me.
just start off, if you could do a little reporting for us. We spoke with the mayor of Atlanta earlier this hour. He said he was hearing reports of a successful day. Lines weren't too long. Ballots are in hand. Take us outside of the city. What are you hearing about the rest of the state? How smoothly or not are things running?
Generally speaking, things have been going smoothly today. We're going to see what the afternoon and the after work rush looks like for the total turnout. A lot of early voting in this election, expecting a pretty good turnout today as well.
Well, when we consider the issues that are driving voters to turn out in the primary, do you feel Republicans are well positioned to defend against what it seems to be, and given historical precedent, a turning tide away from Republicans who have been in majorities in Washington to this point, but polling is suggesting are losing favor among the American electorate, at least when it comes to some policies?
Yeah, well, this president has defied history already. We've only had one other president that's been elected to non-consecutive terms. I think this president and his political operation nationally are laser focused on the House majority. I think if you see what's happening in redistricting around the country, the battlefield has sort of changed. And so I'm cautiously optimistic that the president, the Republican National Committee, and the work we do here in Georgia, we're going to be able to defy history and hold on to the House.
Interesting. There's, of course, the matter of Trump endorsements right here in Georgia as well. He did decide to weigh in on the gubernatorial, but not the Senate race, which I find interesting. And you've got two Republican members of Congress now duking it out with an individual that the governor chose here in Derek Dooley. And it looks like this, as a result, will likely go to a runoff. Is that your expectation this evening? And do you wish the president or the governor, for instance, had taken a stand earlier?
Well, obviously, you like to have as much time as possible to prosecute the general election. But we are where we are. I fully expect it'll be a runoff tonight.
You do.
I will also say, as you said, the president's endorsement is the most valuable currency in a Republican primary election, and I think that's why you're going to see our Lieutenant Governor Burt Jones in a runoff with Rick Jackson in the governor's race. So we're going to do this all again in about 4 weeks.
Sure are.
Well, we're looking forward to covering it then as well. That, of course, 4 weeks. June 16th is the date for the runoff. June 17th is the date that a special legislative session has been called by the governor here in Georgia to consider new congressional maps, not for this cycle, but for 2028. What are you anticipating those maps will look like? And are you worried about watering down safe Republican districts with more Democratic voters, depending on how the lines are drawn?
I'm not worried about that at all. In Georgia and in other states affected by the Voting Rights Act, we've had this artificial sort of racialization of our maps. It's time for that to end. It's time for us to put communities of interest together. My hometown of Columbus, Georgia, is about 90 miles southwest of here. We've never had a single member of Congress. We've been divided between 2 or 3 districts because of these artificial rules that the federal government applied to a handful of states. So I'm excited to see us finally focus on putting communities of interest together. The chips will fall where they may in terms of what it means for partisan up or down. But it's going to be better for Georgians, and so I'm excited about that.
Interesting. That whole effort to redraw maps has put a lot of interest, a lot of additional interest in the state Supreme Court seats that are being contested, and some would argue the remarkable turnout in early voting, which you referenced early on. 1 million people is a record in Georgia. From what we understand, 15% more Democrats early voted than Republicans, the opposite of what we saw last cycle, so it was a 30-point swing. Do you read into that to understand what turnout by party might look like today?
Well, I think you're going to see a lot of people that pull a Democratic ballot vote for incumbent judges. Georgia has a nonpartisan judiciary. It's really unfortunate what the Democratic Party of Georgia and Planned Parenthood and some of their far-left allies have tried to do to make this a partisan election by trying to promote people that frankly want to get elected to any office they possibly can, who have made it clear what they would do if put on the court in violation of our judicial canons, which is why the Judicial Qualifications Commission came out yesterday and cautioned the fact that they believe the rules have been violated. So I think people want competent judges. People want folks that are going to call balls and strikes. Yeah. And so I believe that both Justice Bethel and Justice Warren will be returned.
Well, of course, we haven't seen a Georgia incumbent justice lose their seat since, I believe, 1922. You were telling us you believe Georgians can defy history in terms of how midterm cycles usually go. Do you expect historical defiance in the outcome today, or do you think that precedent may stand?
I think that we're going to see enough turnout today in the Election Day vote. And again, as I said, I think you're going to see a lot of people that pulled a Democratic ballot vote for incumbent judges. It will be very bad for the future of our judicial system if this sort of behavior is rewarded, because what it will mean is polarization of our judiciary, the judiciary being treated as one more political battlefield. And as an attorney, that's something that worries me very much, more so than put the party hat on or off. We want our courts to be independent. I want to feel like when I go to court that I'm going to get a fair hearing, that I'm not going to immediately be lost because these judges that get elected are putting on a Democratic jersey when they get on the bench.
Is Georgia red or purple? I keep reading both.
Georgia's a very competitive state.
Yeah.
I've been chairman for 3 years. I told people in 2024, they said, oh, Georgia's flipped to Joe Biden. There's no way it's flipping back. President Trump showed that Georgia can elect a Republican. But we can't take anything for granted. That's why we're going to be working really hard between now and November.
This is the microcosm.
Yes, indeed. All right, Josh McKoon, thank you so much for joining us. He's chair of the Georgia Republican Party. And still ahead here in Georgia, our conversation with Paige Alexander, the CEO of the Carter Center, about today's primaries in the state and the impact of the conflict between the U.S. and Iran. That's next on this special edition of Balance of Power on Bloomberg TV and Radio.
This is a special edition of Balance of Power on Bloomberg TV and Radio, live from Atlanta, Georgia. Alongside Kaylee Lyons, I'm Joe Matthew. Happy primary day. We're just about an hour and 15 minutes away from polls closing here in Georgia, one of 6 states voting today in primaries. And we have breaking news that we're watching in Washington, D.C. as the United States Senate advances a war powers resolution aimed at the war with Iran. This is a big deal. 50-47, the vote right now. Kaylee, the gavel just dropping here on a piece of legislation that would direct the president to cease military operations in Iran. And we saw none other than the senator from Louisiana, Bill Cassidy, now at the end of his political career because of the challenge posed by President Trump, voting in favor of war powers, which apparently pushed this over the line.
Yeah, and there were also a few Republican senators who were absent from this vote today, including Republican Tom Tillis, who, of course, is not seeking re-election, and interestingly, right, John Cornyn, who just did not receive the endorsement of President Trump in his primary runoff in Texas. So again, 50-47. Those absences are why this number is lower than a typical vote in the Senate. Right. But obviously, this is a major rebuke to the president. It could be the beginnings of the revenge tour of Senator Bill Cassidy.
Yes, indeed. Well, that's right. Tom Tillis may have found a new friend here, and it's interesting that he, of all senators, was not available because he's expressed a lot of concern about war powers, whether it be 60 or 90 days. And this, of course, won't be the end of this. Collins, Murkowski, Paul, and Cassidy. The Republicans voting in favor. John Fetterman, the lone Democrat, once again saying no.
It definitely was a pattern that was emerging. Of course, the question now becomes, could we see something similar in the House as the standoff between the U.S. and Iran and the stalemate over the Strait of Hormuz continues? Is there a turning of the tide as we go closer and closer to the midterm elections and primary season obviously well underway?
Could be a taller order in the House with a live view of the Senate floor right now and breaking news on Bloomberg, war powers advancing. We spoke on the early edition of Balance of Power quite a bit about the conflict with Iran when we spent some time with Paige Alexander, the CEO of the Carter Center, talked about the impacts of the conflict back home, also the work that the center is doing with elections around the country and around the world. We started, of course, by asking about what's happening today, primary day here in Georgia. Listen.
There are winners and losers in every election, and the voters make that decision. And what we at the Carter Center have done in 128 elections in 40 different countries is to very specifically look at the legal framework surrounding elections. And so we're not doing vote tabulation. We are looking specifically at whether the laws are being followed before Election Day, on Election Day, and afterwards. And so we're doing that here in Atlanta in 3 different counties today.
Do you expect a smooth, a successful election here? And have you had any instances or expect to have any instances where you see ICE at a polling site?
We have not, and I would say that Georgia has the smoothest, safest, most secure elections with the paper ballots. It's been counted and recounted numerous times, and we're not worried about that. I think people have gotten out to vote, and early voting numbers were very high as well.
Yeah.
Well, and we were just hearing this from our colleague Tyler as well about what is on the minds of voters as they make their decisions at the ballot box, and a lot of that has to do with the economy, higher gas prices emanating from the war in Iran. You have deep experience in the Middle East specifically, and I wonder if you see a real prospect of a near-term resolution to this conflict, and if we are able to get to that end stage, if you will, what has to happen next in terms of recovery and a humanitarian response?
Diplomacy takes a lot of time, and dropping bombs is far easier. And I think that as we look at what needs to be addressed now, it's protection of civilians, it's de-escalating. There are conflicts happening all over the world, and they don't get better with times and with bombs. They get better with conversations, and that's why the Carter Center's worked in conflict resolution in many of these conflict areas, because when the sides talk to each other, it depolarizes the system at hand, and that's what needs to happen in this case.
We keep hearing the line, history echoes. We came awfully close to having a hostage situation with 2 downed airmen in Iran a couple of weeks ago. Thank God they were rescued. But I wonder if you see this administration, folks planning this operation, as having learned from the experiences that President Carter had with Iran.
President Carter, just as with elections, he won some and he lost some famously. And he had the situation in Iran back in the day. And for the lessons that we learn as a community, as a global community, it's to know who your friends and allies are. And those conversations have to happen. They have to happen directly with our allies. And I think that lesson is still being learned.
Everyone center? You can find our full conversation with Paige Alexander, the CEO of the Carter Center, online or on the terminal. And we want to return now to the breaking news we just got from the Senate floor. The Senate advancing in a procedural vote a war powers resolution that rebukes the president over Iran, signaling perhaps that they could ultimately, in final passage, pass a resolution that would call for the end of hostilities. This procedural vote in the Senate passed 50-47, with 4 Republicans, including Senator Bill Cassidy of Louisiana, who just lost his primary, voting for the resolution. So we want to get into this now and other subjects as we turn to this evening's political panel here in Atlanta, Georgia. We're joined by Madeline Somerville, former speechwriter and advisor for the Senate Democratic Caucus in Georgia, and Mark Roundtree, Republican strategist and president of Landmark Communications. Welcome to you both. Mark, just to begin with you, we obviously are seeing, it seems in Washington, some tides turning when it comes to the war in Iran, and even a Republican majority's willingness to continue to condone it, essentially. Do you expect that there could be some of that happening here in Georgia as well? Are voters losing their tolerance and patience for this conflict?
Georgia traditionally is much more of a pro-military, I guess you could categorize it as sort of a pro-America type state. There have been a lot of changes demographically in the state over the last 20 years, but historically it has been a very pro-military state.
Whether it stays that way throughout this cycle, Jon Ossoff has been pretty clear about where he stands on this, and we've got a pretty tough primary here to figure out who's going to run against him, and it's so close that it is likely to resolve in a runoff. Do you expect that to be the result? And if you're running the Ossoff campaign, who would you rather face?
I certainly do think that it will come to a runoff for the primaries. Who would I rather face? Anybody. Ossoff's going to win.
Care.
Ossoff's going to win.
Why are you so confident?
Because I think he's done a very good job of articulating who he is and what he stands for, and I don't think that anyone else has done that. I know it's a very simple answer, but it's a simple solution to a problem the Democratic Party has had over the last year.
Yeah.
Okay, so she sounds pretty confident. How confident are you feeling?
Except for the fact that Jon Ossoff, there is no poll in the country that shows Jon Ossoff over 50% of the vote. doesn't matter who he's running against, he's never over 50% of the vote right now in any poll. So I would continue to put him in a very vulnerable position, actually.
If you're Ossoff, though, you get set back for another month and watch a couple of Republicans duke it out. Do you wish Brian
Kemp... You get
Kemp...
a couple of months of Republicans spending millions of dollars getting their name and their issues out.
That's fine,
so that's
too.
the other flip of the coin.
Do you wish Brian Kemp had just run and we weren't even having this conversation?
I wish he would do what he thinks is best for himself. I
All
think he's actually doing the right thing for his family.
He would be formidable, would he not?
Yes, he would. And people do like him as a person on both sides behind the scenes.
Well, of course, there's plenty of people who now would like to take his current job.
That's right.
We've got, 15 candidates on the ballot in the gubernatorial race. President Trump did make an endorsement in the gubernatorial race in Burt Jones. Do you expect that ultimately carries him over the finish line?
So the president endorsed the lieutenant governor maybe even a year ago. It's been quite a while in an effort to try to ice out opposition. In the long run, that didn't work. Georgia has a tradition of kind of bucking the president. It is a Republican state that kind of has bucked the president a few times. So right now, I would say the value of that has reached its limit. It has helped Jones a lot to sustain a withering attack from his principal opponent, Rick Jackson.
Yeah, and a heck of a lot of money here. While we're talking money, I need to hear from both of you on what's happening in Kentucky. The most expensive House primary, a $32 million House primary. I don't know what the heck's going to happen in the general election. But will Tom Massie keep this primary under control this evening? Does he live to see another day?
I think he lives to see another day. I think it's likely to go to a runoff. But I think that there is a lot of motivation amongst voters who wouldn't normally come out during a primary to air their grievances against Trump by voting for Thomas Massie and picking up a Republican ballot and doing so.
Interesting.
Well, we just had a headline cross the terminal from Senator John Cornyn of Texas, who is canceling campaign events tomorrow to vote in D.C. We noted earlier he was absent for this War Powers Resolution vote in the Senate this afternoon. But, of course, Cornyn making all of these decisions after not getting the endorsement of the president. Do you think Texas is a different situation than here in Georgia, where you said there's a precedent of bucking the president? Is it so in other red states like that?
Texas doesn't have that same tradition. I think they've been pretty in line with what the president has wanted. This probably is pretty damaging for the senator, I would say.
What about Kentucky? Can Tom Massie get through this or not?
I think maybe a little differently than Madeline. I think that Massie actually may have reached critical juncture. I think they may have been able to get him. We'll see.
Well, they certainly spent a lot of money trying, just quickly on the Senate race and spending money. Democrats have thought they stood a chance of flipping Texas blue for many, many cycles now, and they've spent a lot of money doing so. Do you think that is, once again, a waste of resources this cycle, or is James Tallarico different?
Well, I personally love James Tallarico. I do think that he's different. However, I think that the Democratic Party needed to learn from Kamala's fundraising issues, where she thought the general wisdom used to be the person who raises the most money is the most likely to win. That's obviously not the case anymore, because earned media exists, and you can make a dollar stretch much further if you can just get that viral soundbite that doesn't cost nearly as much. And so I think that the Democrats need to learn it's not about the money, it's about how it's spent.
Just quickly, what's his message to Cornyn voters who he might pull over to his side?
I think he would say, think for yourself.
Okay.
I think he would say you don't have to fall in line. You can think for yourself. I think that's the most empowering message, and it's one that would make people kind of tilt their heads and go, huh.
That'll be the drama for the next week. We got to get through what we have here tonight. Mark Roundtree, Madeline Somerville, thank you so much both for joining us here in a great conversation on Balance of Power. We'll be back here again tomorrow, live from Atlanta, Georgia, with results from primary day, not just here, but around the country.
Yep, we got 6 states to look at, and we'll be breaking it all down for you. So thank you so much for joining us on this special edition of Balance of Power. Alongside Joe Matthew, I'm Kaylee Lyons on Bloomberg TV and Radio.